Good day. Compared to the dramatic events of the previous days, the last 24 hours have been relatively stable on the battlefronts in Ukraine. We're getting more of a trickle of reports of Russian advances in the Kharkiv region towards the town of Kupiansk, the biggest town, by the way, Ukraine captured during its Kharkiv counteroffensive of September. And there's also more news all the time from Bakhmut city. Fighting there appears to be at an extreme level of intensity, with Ukraine, instead of pulling troops out of Bakhmut city, apparently determined to try and reinforce its positions in Bakhmut city, even though, as I discussed extensively yesterday in my video, that seems to me a very wrong way of going about things. I would add, by the way, that there's been some debate about how strategically important Bakhmut actually is. I read account after account saying that it is the absolute focal point, the key position Ukraine has in Donbass, that if Bakhmut were to be captured by the Russians, then the whole Ukrainian defense line in Donbass would start to break down. Against that, there's others who say that Bakhmut isn't as important as that, and that the fighting in Donbass would continue, even if Bakhmut were to be captured by the Russians. All I'm going to say about that is that obviously I'm not a military strategist, as I've said many times. I mean, I'm not really in a position to comment within any expert way about this kind of thing. But the size of the forces involved, the intensity of the battles, and the degree to which Ukraine seems to be trying to cling on to Bakhmut for as long as it can, all of that points, to my mind, to this place being very important indeed, and that the fall of Bakhmut would indeed be a very significant defeat for Ukraine, perhaps compromising the whole of Ukraine's positions in Donbass. But anyway, as I said, fighting there going on, more information all the time of further advances by Russian troops steadily tightening the ring around the city. Now, on the Kherson front, things have been reasonably calm in the sense that Ukraine is licking its wounds after the big defeat it suffered on Wednesday. There's usual reports of reinforcements being sent by Ukraine to replenish its forces and perhaps to look forward to further attacks. But for the moment, there haven't been any further attacks. And the deputy governor, the Russian appointed, I should make clear, deputy governor of Kherson region, Kirill Stromusov, who seems to be much more active from a publicity point of view than the governor himself, that's Mr. Saltko. Kirill Stromusov has now once again reiterated that the current evacuation from Kherson is not because anyone in the Russian political or military hierarchy supposedly expects Kherson city to fall to Ukraine, to be recaptured by Ukraine, or even, and Stromusov was talking about this, he seemed to be poo-pooing the idea that the Ukrainian military would ever even reach Kherson city. He insisted that it was all entirely done in order to put civilians out of harm's way. The evacuation from Kherson city is being done purely to put civilians out of harm's way because of the ongoing missile attacks on the city. And whilst I'm on that topic, there was what Russian reports claim what was a particularly ugly missile attack yesterday, Ukrainian missile attack. I'm not sure that it was on Kherson city itself. There's some suggestions that it was on a ferry point being used to evacuate civilians on the right bank, that's the west bank of the Dnieper River. Apparently HIMARS missiles were launched, 12 altogether. Russians claim that they shot down 11, but one presumably did get through. Anyway, perhaps it was this missile. I may be getting this a bit wrong, but what is indisputable is that one particular missile, or perhaps more than one missile, did strike this ferry point. Civilians were there, and several people, unfortunately, were killed, and a number of civilian vehicles were destroyed. Latest reports, by the way, suggest that the Ukrainian target might have been a Russian television crew, which, by the way, would be terrible. I mean, to my mind, if Ukraine was deliberately targeting civilians and deliberately targeting journalists, and there's a long history, by the way, going all the way back to 2014, which suggests that Ukraine might be doing exactly that. Well, in my opinion, that probably would be a war crime. In fact, I'm sure it would be. But anyway, Stromusov, as I said, seems to be poo-pooing the idea that Ukraine would ever recapture Kherson city. He said that the Russians are defending Kherson city very effectively, that the steppe land, which makes it impossible for Ukraine to conceal its military movements, works to Russia's advantage. It means that Ukrainian troops cannot hide. They can't hide from Russian observation. They can't hide from Russian artillery and airstrikes, all of which makes complete sense to me. So anyway, that is what Stromusov said. Now, I have to say that there are contrary views. There's been a report in the New York Times which says that US intelligence is advising Ukraine that it's entirely possible that Kherson city could be captured at some point over the course of the next 6 weeks, that Ukraine could actually start to recapture important cities in Donbass also within the next 6 weeks, that Russian positions are becoming increasingly fragile, that Russian military units are supposedly close to collapse. I have to say that may be the information US intelligence has. Perhaps US intelligence has information which I don't have, quite possibly they do. But it doesn't seem to me to correspond with what I am seeing of the situation on the ground and the impression I'm getting from Russian reports. From those reports, on the contrary, I'm getting an impression of Russian lines strengthening as more reinforcements are arriving. The Ukrainian General Staff has now apparently confirmed that Russian reservists from this 300,000 man call-up have now been deployed to Kherson region, and as I said previously, it's now clear that the Russians have deployed armoured units to Kherson region and that these have engaged Ukrainian tanks and done so successfully, by the way. That everything looks, on the contrary to me, as if Russian positions are getting stronger rather than weaker. So maybe, as I said, US intelligence, if the New York Times is reporting its findings correctly, is getting some different information. But I can only talk about what I see and what the reports from the front lines suggest. And after all, we did have that defeat that the Ukrainians suffered on Wednesday in Kherson region, which also doesn't seem to me to suggest any significant weakening in Russian lines. Now, the Russian media and their Telegram channels have all picked up on this New York Times article, and they're circulating stories that what it means is that the United States is pressing Ukraine to renew its various offensives and inevitably and quite probably correctly, the Russians are basically saying that this pressure from the United States on Ukraine to launch offensives is connected with the 8th November midterms. The need of the administration to show some tangible success in Ukraine before the midterms take place in order to justify all the vast amounts of money that have been spent on the war. Well, we'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens. We'll see if there are more Ukrainian attacks. I'm absolutely sure that there will be, by the way, despite the apparently now seriously deteriorating weather. And we'll see what happens. Meanwhile, you might have thought that with the situation on the ground now starting to turn against Ukraine once more, with the Russian build-up, with the Russian missile attacks, which, by the way, continue at the same relentless pace, with news of power blackouts now across Ukraine, indeed in Kiev itself, with President Zelensky and his officials telling people in Ukraine that they need to reduce power consumption. This is in winter, Ukrainian winter, very cold winter, that they need to reduce power output, they need to accept electricity cut-offs and things of that kind. You might have expected that with this situation going from bad to worse, or so it seems to me, in Ukraine, that someone would be looking for some kind of way out of this. I see absolutely no sign of that at all. We're now getting reports that the State Department is working overtime to ensure that when the G20, the forthcoming G20 meeting happens in Bali, that Joe Biden doesn't meet Putin even accidentally, that they don't pass each other in a corridor. They're so terrified, apparently, of some kind of contact or meeting with Putin that, the president must be kept out of the way of Putin, regardless of what happens. There's been a whole series of indeed incredibly angry meetings on the part of the EU, lots of angry meetings about the energy situation. EU countries, various EU countries, France, Spain, Italy, are very angry with Germany for its massive financial package supporting German households with their energy costs. There's been demands from some of these countries for a price cap on gas. I gather that's gas from everywhere, not just from Russia. Olaf Scholz, perhaps with lingering memories of the days when Germany had a free market economy, trying to push back in his usual weak way. He seemed to suggest that doing something like that might cause problems with supply, which they will. Anyway, he appeared to push back. He made a speech in the Bundesbank, appearing to rule that out. And then, of course, as he always and invariably does, he weakly agreed to, at least in principle, to what the other EU member states are demanding. So probably we will get over the next few weeks a gas price cap together with an oil price cap, neither of which, of course, addresses the underlying problem of a catastrophic shortage of supply. I received an email from someone in Portugal who says that supplies of LNG from Nigeria to Portugal are now drying up. Qatar has said that it's no longer going to supply further LNG to Europe over the course of this winter. The cost of LNG from the United States is touching stratospheric levels, but European governments, as we see at the moment, what they're focused on is lowering gas prices, which they've temporarily, in my opinion, managed to do, even though the only effect of that is to increase energy consumption, gas production consumption, which at some point is surely going to bring on even more quickly that moment when they've run out of supply. But anyway, that's what they're doing. The idea of talks with the Russians to try to find some kind of way out of this crisis, that's absolutely excluded. Mario Draghi, the outgoing Italian Prime Minister, warned everybody at the European summit that divisions within Europe only play into Putin's hands. That's presumably a threat to Olaf Scholz, that if he holds out against the gas price cap idea, the Russians will be pleased. Can't imagine why they would be pleased, by the way. But anyway, so no movement on negotiations. In Italy, Silvio Berlusconi, Italian politician, former prime minister, head of the Forza Italia party, which is supposed to be part of the new right-wing coalition, made a speech in which he outlined some of the history, gave a potted account of the history of the negotiations and the disagreements that led to the Ukrainian conflict. He took a rather more favourable position to Russia than perhaps is acceptable, though I didn't see that he said anything that isn't factually correct. Italian media were in uproar. Mrs. Meloni, the new Prime Minister, slapped him down, said that if he goes on talking like that, he can't be a member of the new government that is being formed. And the criticisms of Berlusconi from every side of the Italian political system, even as Italy faces a major crisis with energy, and Berlusconi's party has had to backtrack, or has felt obliged to backtrack on his behalf. In Britain, meanwhile, Liz Truss, as predicted on the Duran by myself and by my colleague Alex Christoforou in the various programmes that we've done on the emerging political crisis in Britain, Liz Truss has now resigned. There's supposed to be a new British Prime Minister in place, drawn from the Conservative Party by the end of next week. What the mechanics of achieving that are going to be, I have absolutely no idea, and whether that timetable is realistic. But anyway, there's a leadership election in the Conservative Party. There's talk about trying to find a new Prime Minister. There's general acknowledgement that the country is in the grip of a deepening economic crisis. There's article after article in the British media saying that it's worse than it ever got in the 1970s or early 1980s, the economic situation here. There's even articles which I read which accept that the single biggest mistake, biggest problem in the Truss Kwarteng government's budget proposals was their attempt to support, to pay part of every British household's energy costs, that this was unaffordable in the present situation with rising interest rates and all of that. But, again, no suggestion, no proposal from any politician, any mainstream politician, that the way out of this disintegrating crisis is to try to reopen talks, to try to look for some kind of diplomatic solution. And in the United States, where there is at least fractionally more debate about this than in Europe, we see the same. Now, I've discussed in a recent video my explanation for some of Elon Musk's moves. I personally believe that the problems with the Starlink system are almost certainly the result of Russian jamming of that system. And I also believe that Elon Musk started floating peace proposals and talking about the need for de-escalation in response to the Russian jamming of Starlink and to his concerns about the future of Starlink, into which, of course, he sunk a large amount of money. Well, Elon Musk, for his pains, we're told he's now being investigated. Investigated for what precisely? Russian connections? What Russian connections? Anyway, he's apparently due to be investigated. There's talk that his proposed takeover of Twitter be blocked on national security grounds. I mean, merely for talking about de-escalation, merely for talking about peace proposals, that is apparently enough to get you investigated. I mean, that's the only explanation I can see. And to have your attempt to buy a company, a private commercial transaction, we're always told that Twitter and companies like that are private companies, presumably not strategic assets. Well, apparently the US government is now seriously looking for ways to block Elon Musk's buyout of Twitter. It seems bizarre. And going back to Britain, as I discussed in a recent video Alex and I did on the Duran, I've seen articles from all the usual suspects in the British media. I'm not going to name names. There are legal reasons for that. But anyway, all the usual suspects, which basically warn off any British political leader who is contemplating the possibility from any kind of talks with Ukraine. And indeed, there's even now suggestions that not only should there be more sanctions against Russia, but that the EU and the United States should now press forward with further and further sanctions against Iran because of its alleged sales of kamikaze drones and perhaps ballistic missiles to Russia. Now, I have to say, if we do get into a huge crisis in the West, it's this bizarre mindset which, to my mind, would explain it. Now, perhaps because of the extent to which it's becoming increasingly imperative for people to hold the line on Ukraine, people in the West, I should say, political leaders in the West, we're starting to see now an escalation of language. So I've seen what purports to be a statement by General Mark Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm not absolutely sure that he did say this, but certainly it is a sentiment which I know an increasing number of people either share or pretend to share, that if Ukraine is defeated, the entire West, the entire Western world, the entire Western system would collapse. Now, I have to say, I think that is overstated, wildly overstated. I mean, it reminds me, by the way, of what people used to say in the 1960s about Vietnam, that if Vietnam fell, Southeast Asia would fall, which it partly did, by the way, and then Indonesia would fall, and the Philippines would fall, and the whole of the East Asia Pacific region would fall, and that they'd all fall under the communist yoke, and that the United States would be pushed out of the Asia Pacific region. Well, that didn't happen in the 1960s. The whole domino theory that was used to justify the US intervention in Vietnam, it turned out that real life just doesn't work like that. I'm going to say this. In the case of Ukraine, I think there is more truth to it. I don't think that the entire West would collapse if Ukraine were defeated. I think that is wildly overstated. But if, after this vast investment in money, machinery, weapon systems, training, intelligence, all of that, the Russians do indeed win in Ukraine, as, by the way, I firmly expect, then I have absolutely no doubt at all that the international prestige of the Western powers, of the United States first and foremost, will be severely damaged, and it will become even clearer that the unipolar moment, the period of US hegemony, of US global dominance, is behind us. The US will have taken on Russia in an area in Europe where the US is supposed to be strongest, and it will have lost. And that will have a global impact. And it will, of course, have an even bigger impact in Europe itself, especially in Eastern Europe. I mean, I suspect that countries in Eastern Europe, seeing an American defeat, and it will now be seen as an American defeat if Russia does win in Ukraine, well, I can see that some of the countries, the Eastern countries that make up NATO, countries like Slovakia, possibly the Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, might start to wobble. They might start to say to themselves, well, we picked back in the 90s what we thought was the winning side, except it's turning out that it isn't. And that might cause alarm, and that might cause splinterings and fractures within NATO. It could also be that in other parts of the Western Alliance, in Germany, Italy, France, doubts about the political class, the wisdom of US leadership, the wisdom of the EU consensus, that they will grow, and they will grow considerably. Perhaps they should. And of course, another big country, Turkey, might seek to capitalize on what would be perceived as an American defeat, to forge ahead with its Eurasian connections, to develop, in other words, its foreign policy and its defense and its geopolitical relationships even more independently from the US than it is doing now, perhaps up to the point where it might even seriously consider quitting NATO. So I do think that, though it's over dramatic to talk about the collapse of the West if the US is defeated in Ukraine, undoubtedly the US and Western position globally will take a very, very severe hit. Well, however, having said that, that was surely a reason for not getting involved in Ukraine at all. I mean, Barack Obama, long ago, in 2016, seems like an age ago now, actually warned against overcommitment to Ukraine, saying that it was an area of Russian national interest, where the Russians would always have escalatory dominance. If the situation is indeed as bad as people like Mark Milley apparently believe, then it is because that one piece of good advice that Obama has given over the course of his career has not been followed. And I can't help but think that if the stakes are indeed as high as that, if the future of the West now really does depend on what happens in Ukraine, then that points not to doubling down, not to escalating, but instead to looking for a diplomatic outcome, thereby hopefully avoiding at least some of these terrible consequences that people are talking about. But as I said, No sign of that at the moment. Robert Barnes, who does live streams with us, has said that it's now looking increasingly likely that the Republicans are going to win big in the midterms on the 8th of November. And Robert Barnes has also told us that there is now a groundswell of feeling within the Republican Party, which takes the view that enough is enough where Ukraine is concerned, that Ukraine has been given a blank check for far too long, that the American commitment to Ukraine is out of all proportion to whatever benefit the United States might think it's extracting from it, and that the new Congress, which will convene in January, is likely to start dialing down on aid to Ukraine. And the man, Mr. McCarthy, who looks likely to become the Speaker of the House if the Republicans do win in the midterms, he's also said that the days of a blank check for Ukraine may end with the new Congress. So, what is the response of the political class? Are they taking note of the fact that there appears to be a groundswell of opposition in the United States to this unending support for Ukraine? Are the Democrats rethinking their position, given that their star AOC has now been heckled by anti-war activists on the left for her support for the intervention, for her support for the war in Ukraine? Not a bit of it. Apparently, the current congressional leadership, Democrat and Republican, is responding to the changes, the possible changes in the stance of the next Congress by trying to ram through another giant weapons package, an aid package for Ukraine through the existing Congress before it finally packs up and goes away. And figures of up to $50 billion are being talked about, even though, as several people have pointed out, $50 billion at the rate that Ukraine is spending money is actually unlikely to get Ukraine past April, never mind the whole of 2023. But anyway, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about responding to the fact that this war is becoming unpopular. They want to increase the funding that Ukraine is getting. I'm going to say, I'm not sure that this is actually going to happen. I would have thought that a lot of Republicans, especially in the House, are going to be very leery of this kind of thing. They will be telling their congressional leaders that ramming through an aid package of this scale in order to preempt what the next Congress might do at the tail end of the existing Congress, with presumably most of the votes taking place after the midterms have actually taken place, that all of that is frankly unwise and irresponsible and politically provocative. And I think there might be some opposition from House Republicans. And remember, they're a large bloc already. They almost account for almost half the the membership of the House. They're only a few seats short of the Democrats in the House. I would have thought that there's a real risk that if this was pushed in that way, the Republican Party would split and there would be a lot of blood on the carpet and a lot of angry words. And I'm not sure in the end that Republican leaders in Congress would want to risk the quarrel, the argument that might follow. Then again, you have people like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney, who seem determined to support Ukraine, perhaps in part because of the opposition of their own electoral base, because of the animus that some of them have to the populist wing of their own party. Anyway, we will see what happens. I can't help but finish with one other thing. It isn't just over Ukraine that we see no sign of any rethinking, any sign of any reverse gear starting to be applied. One of the most alarming things I've been reading in various places over the last few weeks is about the US's attempt to suffocate, to choke off advanced microchip sales to China. The assumption, which by the way I think is wrong to the point of absurdity, is that if the United States restricts transfers of microchips and sales of microchips to China, then that will prevent China from working through its various plans of developing its IT industries, and will once again put the United States in a position of advantage. The people who are telling you that are the same people who way back in January and February were telling you that the sanctions that they were planning to impose on Russia would cause the Russian economy to crater. Well, just as the Russian economy did not crater, so I expect that restrictions on microchip sales to China will not affect Chinese plans. They will merely make the Chinese, with their enormous resources, work harder on developing their own microchip and semiconductor industry, to the point where they can produce microchips at least as good, probably better, than those made in Taiwan and South Korea, and indeed, of course, the United States itself. But anyway, that's not the point I wanted to dwell on. The point that really caught my notice is one or two articles which I've seen, one or two comments which I've seen in various places, in which it's actually been suggested that restricting sales of advanced microchips to China might actually hasten a Chinese attack on Taiwan. The rationale, which by the way I think is crazy, being that that's the only way that China can get its hands on advanced microchips and advanced technology to make those microchips. I think that is utterly wrong, to the point of being crazily wrong. But it does make me wonder when I read articles of this kind and the tone in which some of these comments are written in, that this isn't what some people want to happen. That they aren't actually hoping that the restrictions, that they are actually hoping that the restrictions on the export of advanced microchips to China will indeed provoke the Chinese into precisely that kind of action. Indeed, I go further still. I wonder whether part of the thinking of some of the people who are proposing and who are in fact enforcing these restrictions of the sale of advanced microchips to China, whether the intention behind those steps might in fact be to provoke the Chinese, to create another provocation for the Chinese, leading to a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Now, if that's so, then it's further confirmation of my long-standing point that neocons and people like that have no reverse gear. In fact, it seems that what they do when they run into obstacles is that instead of reversing gear, they go into a higher gear. They're now trying to find some way, or so it would seem, or so it seems to me, to provoke a war with China. You know, sending Pelosi there doesn't work, well, try imposing a ban on sale to China of advanced microchips. But some people might actually want a conflict between China and Taiwan that might involve the United States. Seems to me so reckless that it is beyond my understanding. And yet, the drift of some of the articles that I'm seeing seem, if anything, to point precisely in that direction. I remind you all of something that Garland Nixon, brilliant commentator that he is, said to me in a private email, which is that this is an extremely dangerous administration, looking for confrontation at every conceivable point, hoping, in fact, for confrontation at every conceivable point. And far from wanting to avoid the risks involved in escalation, actually looking for escalation in disregard of those risks. Well, if this is correct, if this analysis that I've given about the whole microchip business with China is correct, well, you have one more proof of this. This is not sustainable. At some point, in some way, something will give. I don't know what it will be, whether we'll get a new political leader appearing in the West. At the moment, it seems to me it can only be in either the United States or just possibly France. Some leader who wants to chart a new course and who tells the truth about the direction that things are taking. Very difficult for that person, I would have thought, whoever he or she is, to win out against the hysteria. But then again, you never know, perhaps the economic crisis will concentrate minds in some way. But unless a political leader steps in, then eventually events will impose their own solution. Now, when I talk about events, already there's been talk from people like Rubini, the famous economist, others, about a massive recession that's now going to hit us in the West. Not just a recession, food shortages, energy shortages, a period of prolonged economic and perhaps political chaos. And to be very clear, anybody who thinks that they can ride, who can surf that wave, who's actually seeking to provoke chaos in the hope that that will work to their advantage, is deluded. Well, that might even be the best outcome, because given how high the stakes are now becoming and how extreme the language and rhetoric is, I wonder whether some even more drastic escalation, if things begin to go seriously wrong in Ukraine or anywhere else, might be on the cards. Anyway, on that rather ominous thought, I'm going to end this program today. As I said, little news from Ukraine itself at the moment, but no doubt there'll be more before long. And for that, you'll have to wait, obviously, to my next video. And besides, I'll be covering a lot more things, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. And remember, you can find us on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, and now Rofkin. And of course, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying yourself the great things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button to this video. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day. Until then.